Thank you very much, Mr. Co-Chair, and I also want to add my voice in thanks to the folks who've come here today for the work you've done. It's been enormously helpful. Let me touch on a couple of the issues and develop a few a little bit further if I could. One, obviously we all know as a given that the federal revenue is ultimately a function of our economy. But I think it's worth noting, and I think you'll all agree, that the growth in federal revenue is related to the growth of the economy, but in fact, federal revenue will grow faster as long as the economy is growing than the growth of the economy. And since Dr. Rivlin is the professional economist on the panel, I wonder if you'd just confirm that as a general rule, if we have strong economic growth, we will have even faster federal revenue growth.
That used to be true, Senator, before we indexed the tax system. It's much less true now. If you have strong growth, federal revenue will go up a little faster than the economy. Not much. We gave away that tool actually with the indexing.
All right, so we could have a discussion about how much that magnitude is, but even now there is some additional growth faster than GDP growth. One of the things that came out from our discussion with CBO about this is that 0.1% of additional GDP growth on average over 10 years, they estimate results in about $300 billion of additional revenue to the government. Now, this is not perfectly linear, and I understand that, but very roughly, if that were to be roughly true, less than 0.5% of average greater economic growth would result in, coincidentally, about $1.2 trillion, which is the statutory goal here. I'm not suggesting that that's an alternative to our doing the work that we do, but I think it underscores how important it is that whatever we do, attempt to create an environment to maximize growth. My own view from the beginning has been that the most constructive thing we can do to maximize economic growth is major reform of both the corporate and the individual tax codes. I don't think there's any dispute about that, but I wanted to drill down a little bit. For instance, there's many approaches one could take. Let's look at the individual side for a moment. And for sake of argument, if we were to reduce the value of all the deductions that are currently available to individuals and we had an equivalent reduction in rates, for sake of argument, everybody agrees that would be very pro-growth. Is that right? There's consensus on that. My understanding from both Mr. Bowles and Senator Simpson was that when you folks looked at this exercise of reducing deductions and credits and write-offs, lowering rates, you did it with roughly a 10-to-1 ratio. For every dollar that was dedicated to lowering rates, there was a dollar dedicated to deficit. I think you had suggested that it was like 92 to 8.
Yeah.
So 10-to-1, 11-to-1, that was about the ratio. Do you recommend that we take an approach like that, where we would, on the individual side, do that kind of simplification, lowering of rates, and have a ratio comparable to that?
Yeah, I think you'll run into some of the problems that Senator Baucus brought up. That's why we presented two options. If you go with the zero plan and get rid of all of the tax expenditures, then you do create enough resources that you can use only 8% of the resources and still generate $1 trillion worth of additional revenue that could go to reduce the deficit. However, if you're going to go back and not get rid of all of these tax expenditures, but you're going to keep some of them, like some of the Democrats will want to keep the earned income tax credit, they'll want to keep the child tax credit, some of you may want to keep, go to a credit for mortgage insurance, for mortgage, to help people with their mortgage debts. Some people might want to go to a credit for charitable contributions. So anything you keep gives you a smaller pie to work with.
Yeah.
So if you're still going to come up with $1 trillion of deficit reduction, then that 1-to-10 ratio won't work anymore.
Okay. Does everybody on the panel agree that if any package were to include net tax revenue, it ought to come in the context of reform that actually lowers marginal rates?
Yes.
Yes.
Let me move over to health care for just a second, and I'm glad, I think, again, that there was a consensus, I think it was unanimous, that it is our health care costs that is driving the deficit and debt crisis that we have. It's been my view, and I wonder if anyone disputes this, that in fact our Medicare plan essentially drives the entire health care sector. And while there is obviously a significant private sector component, to a large degree, it is a reaction to, and it acts in the context of what Medicare does. And so Medicare is the real driver of the entire health care picture. Do you agree with that?
Yes.
Yes, and there are instances in which Medicare has actually done significant reforms, and the private sector has followed.
Right.
Yeah, and I only agree with part of it. You said that Medicare was the only, I'm not sure you said only, but Medicare is one of the drivers of our deficit problem. It's not the only driver. I think it is the number one problem.
What I said was that health care is and I meant to say is the primary driver.
Yeah.
Senator Kerry talked about structural reform. It seems, in my view, meaningful structural reform means getting away from fee-for-service. That is, to me, that's the heart of Medicare. That's the heart of the design. And because we use this terminology and assume that everyone knows it, I'll take a crack at describing what I think of as fee-for-service and tell me if I've characterized it right. But essentially what we have is a committee here in Washington that specifies the price it will pay for every conceivable medical procedure, the circumstances under which it will pay it, the people who are permitted to perform it, where they're allowed to perform it, in which venue, and it is a completely government-controlled mechanism, which also, by the way, doesn't account for whether the outcome is successful or not and whether the procedure needs to be repeated. Is that a fair characterization of fee-for-service?
Yeah, I think what I said earlier in answer to Senator Kerry was that I think we're going to have to move from paying for quantity to paying for quality. And I think you're saying something very similar.
Well, I am. I think at the heart of this necessarily creates all kinds of inefficiencies, misallocations, perverse incentives, and the solution has to be to get away from this. I guess my last question for everybody, are all of you confident that...
Before you proceed, I did want to make an observation. We recognize that Medicare has very significant problems of the type you were alluding to, and that's why we are here suggesting that it be changed.
Right.
At the same time, we have explained why we said as we move,
right,
we don't move so quickly with getting rid of one and establishing the other that we lose both or lose all reform.
One of the things that concerns me is that as long as we leave a significant fee-for-service component in place, I worry about whether the reforms are capable of defeating the mechanism and the misallocations and the sort of perverse effects of that fee-for-service. So I would ask this, do you think it's possible to devise a plan that would transition completely away from fee-for-service, some kind of premium support model that is defined to ensure that the most vulnerable people have the coverage that they need?
Well, I'll say for the time being and for the foreseeable future, it seems to me you cannot do that. You have to go with some transition. You wouldn't get the other done. That was the question, whether you can get it done. I'm not an expert. I didn't sign on for this job to be an expert on Medicare. That's why I don't answer some of your questions. But I'm saying practically I don't think it could be done now. Under this circumstance, we have to.
I'm not suggesting that so much, but I appreciate the response. Dr. Rivlin?
Well, I agree with the Senator. I think that the idea, we believe that actually a competition between, on a well-designed exchange between comprehensive health plans, particularly capitated plans, they would win out in a fair competition. There are parts of the country, especially rural parts of the country, where it probably isn't feasible right now to do that. And that's why we think there ought to be a transition, and that it is much less scary for seniors to say, if you like what you've got, you can stay with it. And but you're going to be offered something which is likely better.
Yeah, and I would say if you look at some of the pilot projects in the Affordable Health Care Act, they have some some good examples in there of experiments that are going on today to do just what you're talking about.
All right. Thank you all very much.
Gentleman yields back. The co-chair now recognizes the gentleman from Maryland, Congressman Van Hollen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to join my colleagues in thanking all of you for your